today we're going to have another fantastic session on this channel where we're actually going to get Martyn and myself with over 30 years of industry experience. We're going to talk about what source controls are, what CI/CD systems are, and how we can relate the different CI/CD systems to each other. We're going to look at Azure Devops, code pipeline, code build. We're going to talk about Circle CI usage, GitHub, Bitbucket, Jenkins, Code Catalyst, and also Gitlab. So you have all of the buzzwords here. And I'm really glad to introduce my guest today, which is once again Martyn. Great to have you on.
Hello, how are you?
Doing pretty well, thank you so much. A lot of things going on, as I already told you offline.
Yeah.
And you are one of the very few people that can still pride with beating me twice in AWS Game Days. So I think those that might have been following us on the socials might have seen that. We competed in the Game Day World Championship in 2020. I think it was 2. And then last year at reInvent we met again, if I recall correctly.
Well, it wasn't quite fair. You didn't have a laptop.
Oh no, I don't know. I think we don't need a laptop for a game day, right?
So yeah, it's all in your mind. That's it.
Yeah, but it was great fun, and actually having you and the rest of the team in the room as well. It was a pleasure to see you again.
Yeah.
So let's jump into topic for today. Before we get started with the detailed source control, what is that? Why do we need that? Why do you think that it is important?
So I was, so when I first left university and my first job, it was a very small company. Like the development team was like 2 people. But when I started, the first thing they did was basically give me a pen drive to code on. And, this was quite a large e-commerce site, one of the biggest in the UK for its area. And I don't really remember doing much with source control at university. I remember a little bit, like I definitely had experience with Subversion at the time. This was before Git. So, one of my first jobs was to bring the source control in. And you can imagine if there's only one of you working, then even now I definitely use source control even if it's just one of us. But if there's one of you working on it, it's not as bad. But as soon as there's like multiple people working on this code, we couldn't just copy it around to each other. You had clashes, so how do you merge them together? You have no tooling for that. And it'd be quite easy to lose that code. So you'd actually go onto the production servers and copy it back down to your system and edit it because you never knew what actually was in production. It was always a guess. So I guess source control at that time was literally just what's on production and then a load of manual tasks. So yeah, as soon as you've got some kind of source control where you can have multiple people working on it, you've got a history, you've got a backup, and then all the other tooling that goes on top of that. It's a lifesaver.
Yeah, and I have a similar experience. When I started to do code, I was copying PHP files to my server to do production deployments, manually, of course, right? Obviously, I was at the start, the only one working on it, so I didn't really need a source control. But quickly, it became important for me to be able to go back in the different versions, right? And this is also where a source control system will help you a lot.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and that saved my life a lot of times, definitely. But yeah, it was interesting because we moved from Subversion to, I think it was Subversion at the time, and then Mercurial before Git really worked on Windows. Because it was a Microsoft house. And it's, I can't even, the amount of times I've had to go back or just look at the history. Even in that first couple of years when I first started working on it, I just couldn't imagine working without source control now.
Yeah, same for me. And obviously then after putting your sources to the source control system, there is also the next step, right? Where you take your source code and sometimes you need to build it or package it up right, before you can actually deploy it. And this is where the continuous integration and continuous deployment system or the workflow systems come into place. And those that follow the channel have most probably heard a lot about the different CI/CD systems or have seen them at use. So what's different in this session today, right? I saw some of your posts on LinkedIn talking about I know all of the CI/CD systems by now, and I thought, okay, cool, that's a great idea to have a conversation about what's the good and the bad parts of the different tools based on the over 10 years experience that you have with them. So let's try to define in a very abstract way, what are CI/CD tools and why do they help you to do your job on a day-to-day basis?
I think the simplest definition to me is it's a repeatable process. So there's all kinds of benefits that come with it in terms of the time saving, but it's ultimately just the ability to have this kind of repeatable process that will always run. So whether that's as simple as making sure you lint the codes in the same way so that we all have a consistent code base, or get to the point where it's a consistent deployment, so that you've got a real confidence that every time you put code in there, you'll get the exact same output. That will then mean that you have no issue deploying at 1 a.m. or middle of the day. It doesn't matter. It's the exact same process that has been ran thousands of times before.
So if that's an automated process, isn't that just a shell script?
I mean, I guess ultimately, yes. I would say if you've got a shell script that runs on check-in using a load of manual processes, that is CI/CD in a sense. Obviously, a lot of these systems, especially ones we'll touch on in a bit, just fancy UIs and fancy tooling built on top of what's ultimately a bash script of some sort.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, right? So CI/CD pipelines and tools, in a sense, are really workflow automations that help you to bring something from one place to another place or multiple places at the end, right? But still, there's a lot of vendors in the space, right? And that is kind of what makes me feel like there is some money in that, and there's some reason why we're not all building bash scripts. So maybe let's start diving into the different tools. And which one would you like to start talking about of the different ones?
I guess follow my career slightly might make it easier. So I think the first time I'd have what I'd call some proper tooling was, so that they actually used for source control, they use a tool called Azure, which anyone who's heard of it would be groaning right now. It's an enterprise system, and it doesn't follow any of the principles of Git or anything like that. It's like this weird stream-based system.
Okay.
So it's a custom source control with no CI/CD, no kind of ability to automate. It was just source control. So that was hooked up to Jenkins. This was on-prem, an enterprise environment, and it made a lot of sense because obviously you need a system which is can run on-prem, and something that's quite, at the time, especially Jenkins was, I think, one of the only ones that could run on-prem. I think this was before GitLab and so on. So yes, but many years, like, they had a full team who would do the Jenkins kind of scripts and so on for us. Like, the developers wouldn't do that. But obviously, you can imagine they don't know your code. So I'd spend a lot of time working with Jenkins to try and build these automations for the developers, because the team who were controlling that didn't quite understand exactly what needed to be done. And then, this isn't a compliance kind of system as well, so there's a lot of stuff that has to be change control and so on. So yeah, there's a lot of work in Jenkins there, and I think I mean, you've got way more experience in Jenkins than myself, I'm sure. So but my sort of, all I recollect from using it is very powerful. Like, there's a lot of stuff you can do because you can put any script you want in there. There's a lot of ability, but you have to manage a lot of stuff yourself. It's not.
Yeah, so
just
we've
click
been
around.
using Jenkins. We've been using Jenkins for a while, and I have kind of some proficiency in building scripted pipelines in Jenkins as well. But as you mentioned, right, it's great to have that possibilities and flexibilities at hand. But at the same time, you need to manage all of the plugins that you're using, all of the dependencies. You need to write the scripts. You need to dive deep into how Jenkins is actually hosted and these kind of things, right? And I think the UI is also not really fancy sometimes, right?
Yeah.
And then there's I would say the challenge with Jenkins mainly is that everyone using it needs to be an expert. And that's something that in a bigger organization is hard to get to. At least that's my observation, right? And then it always falls down to individuals to solve some of the challenges. And then Jenkins has been, I personally think, bad at managing the documentation for the tool that they offer because of it being open source or kind of open source, and also not investing a lot into making a lot of the best practices that you should be following transparent, right? And because of that plugin system and all of the things that comes together, right? And I think this is why personally I'm kind of happy that we're past that in my organization. But there's still a big portion of enterprises using Jenkins these days, right?
Yeah. And I think it is a bit that kind of island, that closed island. You need to have specialists, and you end up in a situation where you've got a full team working on that, and the enterprise is like, well, we've got a team, do this, it all works. We've got a lot of power, we've got a lot of actual code and scripts that have been written in this thing. It's quite hard to get away from it at that point. But we did. At that enterprise, we did move away, but part of that was because we moved away from Acuref, so we moved to Git. Because obviously the world moved to Git, and it makes sense. But I'm quite glad that they at the same time decided to move systems. I mean, one of my main issues with Jenkins, is just in general, is I don't like having CI/CD tools that are outside of source control. I like the fact that they're all integrated together. So, imagine like a GitHub Actions or a Bitbucket and so on. Just because, to me, I want that feedback loop to be there immediately. Now, I know you can feed back from an external system, but that's just another thing you've got to configure.
That's true, yeah. It feels a little bit clunky, especially that connectivity.
Yeah, exactly. So
cool. Then, I don't know. What was next on your journey? You said you moved over to Git. Was it directly GitHub or?
It was, because it was on-prem, they went to GitLab, which, was actually quite a good experience. I had experience with Git personally, but this was enterprise Git. So
help me set the context a little bit, Martyn. GitLab offers source control and CI/CD at the same time, right?
Yeah. It's also got a lot of security kind of tooling in there as well. It's got, there's actually quite a lot of features in GitLab. It's like metrics, and the biggest issue with it is they call it merge request and not pull request, which is kind of confusing for any other tool doesn't use merge request, but it does actually have a lot of extra integrations, some of which we didn't use. So you can do like designs, wireframing, and all kinds of things like that in it. Got a very good wiki, so documentation in there is actually really good. I remember the metrics and the monitoring being quite powerful. And then you have these ideas of agents that you set up these, what we set up anyway, with loads of virtual machines which are registered as agents. So we would have, say, 5 or 6 of these runners, which means our pipelines make use of them. And then you could do the kind of things you'd expect, like pin a certain runner to a certain task. So if you needed to install something on a box, could, but it's all integrated together. So you push your code into GitLab, and then GitLab itself would run CI and have a really nice UI on top of that.
And you can automate kind of all of that, right? So that means that you can trigger a specific workflow after a push, most probably.
Yeah.
Is it also possible to react on commit messages?
I can't remember if we did it on specific commit messages. One of the things that was quite big there was the systems that we were working on at the time were quite monolithic. So you would actually have, say, 20 or 30 dev environments, and you'd need to choose which dev environment to deploy to. So somebody would say, okay, you're on this environment, because nobody else is using it. And then as you commit in, you would link your branch effectively to that environment. And then when it went into main, you'd go through the kind of main UAT environment and so on. But yeah, it wasn't necessarily continuous deployment, continuous integration, in the sense that there was a lot of manual. You'd push in and you'd have to choose which environment to deploy to manually, because you never knew which environment, and it was only really the automated deployment to when you went to main that went into kind of staging environments, but it'd never go all the way up to production, because production had to go for another team, because again, kind of change control and stuff like that. It was never fully integrated when I was there. I believe it's got better since I left, in the sense that they've come up with a way to take the same package that was built onto UAT and transfer
then
it to
promote it up. So does GitLab then also allow artifact management or dependency management in that sense? Because that's what you just touched on.
Yes, but they didn't use it for that at this company. They had a separate system. We actually built something where we would, have these custom packages ourselves, and the actual application would self-update to almost get around some of them problems, because we could deploy these artifacts to a specific place. I think we used ProGet. That was what we used for artifact management, which is like a hosted NuGet.
Okay. Cool. That's GitLab. And you can host it on your own, and you can buy it from the vendor as well. So you can get a managed service, I think.
It's quite expensive, I think. I think it is quite expensive as an option. Like, quite a lot more expensive than
the managed service one?
Yes. Okay. So self-hosting is expensive in the sense of operation expenses, but I believe the cost is like 3-4 times as much as some of the competitors. But that's because I think of all the extra features and tooling. Like, it's got everything you can imagine you want in there.
Okay, good. I don't have any experience with GitLab, but I've heard a lot of people saying that it is kind of working very well, right? With the downsides that you already mentioned. No one mentioned the merge request thing to me yet, so that's interesting.
It's quite confusing. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense actually, a merge request, because you want to request, you want to merge in a way, but it's just so different to everything else that it's a bit confusing when you go from one to the other.
Cool. So then let's jump over to something else. Maybe let's go into code pipeline, code build.
Yeah,
maybe code commit. So the AWS kind of tools. Yeah.
So after that, I went to started working with AWS. So the first thing we built with AWS was actually using code pipeline and build, but it was actually using GitHub for source control. And it was worked quite well, but it touched on what I've touched on earlier. There's a lot of integration points. So you've got GitHub, you check in, and then you have to have a webhook fired into AWS for code pipeline to run, and obviously want to report status back so that it shows in GitHub, so you can constantly get them status updates. The main issue I had with it is the fact that you'd be in GitHub, and then you'd have to go and log into AWS to see what's happening, and if a build fails, you'd have to try and find where that pipeline is almost to go and look at that. But it worked really well. Obviously there's a lot of capabilities, and the main issue we had as well at the time was we weren't using a a trunk-based development system, like AWS quite prescribed about their branching strategy until 2 months ago, 1 month ago.
No. I think it was until like 3 weeks ago or something like that. So Code Pipeline has just announced the possibility to support multiple branches or to support branch-based development flows at the end. But I think it was I can link it in the show notes. It was like 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, that would have helped. And to be honest, I do prefer having that single chunk-based system. The problem we had with it was the development side, and I've never quite got how AWS, and then this is where you might have some good experience in this area, is if you've got, say, 10 developers working on a single code base and they all wanted to be able to deploy to a dev environment to test, we had ephemeral environments there, which is kind of what we touched on in our last call, and which is great. But when you've got a single code pipeline that didn't quite work, we ended up, when you created a branch, that would fire a webhook to create a code pipeline for your branch. And, then you'd have to clean that up. It's not quite self-managing.
Yeah, that was one of the most hated things of Code Pipeline, at least for me as well before, right? And I hope I didn't try that new functionality, but I hope that changed now, so you don't need to manage that anymore. I used Code Pipeline only in the context of CDK pipelines, where you could write your pipeline as code in CDK, which would then actually deploy the pipeline. It would also self-mutate if there's an update, and I really liked that thing, right? Another thing that I didn't like about code build and code pipeline, and the combination of that, was always that code build a lot of the times needed a few minutes to get started.
Yeah.
So because of the way that it has been built. And that was then very slow, right? But I think that what I expect there is that Code Catalyst has a workflow engine that supports executing builds on Lambda, and I would hope that this is something that will also be available in Code Build soon, which would then drastically reduce the startup times, right? So today Code Build, I think, uses containers under the hood, but executed on a container managed service, most probably. And if they switch that over to Lambda, we might be seeing additional speed up of that build times as well. I don't even know if there's something already available or not. But that would be cool, right? So those would be the two things that I didn't really like about Code Pipeline. But if you look at the built-in CDK pipelines mechanism of implementing that AWS release strategy. I don't know if you read that article around my CI/CD pipeline is my release captain from Claire Ligori, where she explains how AWS rolls out changes, right? That's kind of the thing that really helps people, because it's an opinionated way of doing things. And I would assume AWS has some experience in rolling out things through pipelines, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what I really like about that idea. I also didn't like, I still don't like what you already mentioned with the pipeline being in one AWS account. How do you remember that this was used in the projects that you were part of? So did you have one AWS account for all of the pipelines, or did you have the pipeline in the relevant account? How did you do that setup?
Yeah, so it was the pipeline was in the account, and obviously that's again not what AWS recommend. But we did, after that project, we moved on from Code Pipeline, which we'll touch on in a bit anyway. I think this was before we started using CDK as well. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we'd have a development account, a staging account, production account, and there'd be 3 pipelines linked to main in there. And it means that you'd have a different thing that's being deployed because you're building different. So going back, I wouldn't do it that way, because I'd want a single pipeline so I can have the single artifact being deployed. Mm-hmm. But it's and it does make sense to do that. But it's the speed thing is the biggest issue I had to be honest. I want a fast feedback loop, 100%.
Cool.
Yeah, so I think from
that, then maybe one last comment on code pipeline. How do you like the UI of those tools?
So I think code pipeline itself never really had a problem with the we actually had quite a complicated pipeline in the end where you'd have like 5 cloud, because originally it was CloudFormation, 5 CloudFormation stack deploying at the same time and all parallel, and you've got all the different steps. Then jumping into that to get into code build to then try and find your test results and to look at the test report. It's all there, but it would be a little bit difficult to navigate, find, which just took a bit of time. And when we had new developers, they just couldn't find it.
Yeah, so I think another thing about that is that those tools are really building blocks, and you need to still connect them together in the same way that you need to connect Jenkins to a source control, right? Yeah. So you need to connect code pipeline to a source repository, which can then be code commit, which can then be GitLab or GitHub or whatever, right? So it's not a really interconnected solution from my perspective.
Yeah.
Cool, then let's get to the elephant in the room, and let's talk about GitHub.
Yeah, so GitHub, I've got it currently set up because I use it for personal projects. So like my website, for example, is through GitHub and using GitHub Actions. Obviously, said it a few times, but the fact it's integrated with source control, I think it's just a big boost. It's all together. It's a single config, and it's fast. Like I can check in from my machine, and by the time I've navigated to GitHub to check on the pipeline or something, it's already finished. I think the biggest thing I've found with it is the library of actions that are out there, that kind of marketplace, because like I'm using Hugo for my website, and there was an action there for doing the Hugo build. I don't have to do much. Link it up to do it.
Well, you're underestimating the fact that you need to trust the developer of that action.
Well, yeah, there is that, but at least it's open source though, so there is that. But yeah, I think it's obviously, I guess we can all say that now, it is almost a requirement as a developer that you need to know GitHub. You need to have a GitHub profile and so on. So everyone's understands GitHub. Even if you don't like GitHub and don't like the fact it's Microsoft owned, we all know it. It's easy to use. It's very popular.
Yeah, I think so too, right? It's kind of the standard in open source these days, right? It really requires you to at least know, where do I find source code, where do I find issues, and where do I find GitHub actions, so workflow executions at the end. If you want to be in professional software development, I think that's kind of a thing that you just need to do, right? It all sounds fun in open source, right? If you get into the enterprise using GitHub Actions, GitHub, I think there's way more that you need to think of, right? Because of GitHub being that popular, it can be tricky to make sure that people don't push to the wrong GitHub at the end, right? So the wrong organization or things like that, and that's I think something that might be a little bit challenging. Also, how do you set up approval rules or things like that, right? And
we one of the clients we worked with was quite an enterprise size using GitHub, and they started to use Circle CI to expand, and I think it was partly that the thing that always made me a bit nervous about GitHub is because it's so public. It is that kind of thing of you're using almost your personal GitHub to connect to this thing. I know you can have separate accounts, but you can push to the wrong repo easier. I don't know. It just feels a lot more like you're kind of playing in a slightly open sandbox, even though it's your personal. Like I actually came across, I can't think it was Sony Australia or somebody like that who had set all their repos to public by accident, and it had database dumps in there and all sorts. And I sent them an email, and immediately they changed it to private. But it's terrifying.
Yeah, that's terrifying, and I think that's a problem there as well. On the other side, right? So I'm really on the CI/CD side, as you know, and GitHub has the possibility to execute workflows locally. So to kind of replicate the same kind of thing, like actions, the way that they would be running on GitHub, and that is obviously a cool thing because it speeds up your development cycle. And I think that's something that other providers don't really offer today, right?
Yeah, that's huge. I've spent a lot of time with a branch with 1,000 commits trying to fix like a CI/CD issue, especially if it's right at the end.
Yeah,
so painful.
What's the top thing that you hate about GitHub?
The UI of the actions and things like that. I've never say I really hate it. It's just I'm not used to it. I've not really. It doesn't seem to me. It's just found a bit hard to navigate that kind of area because I wasn't used to it. The biggest issue, really. I don't know. I've not used it for its CI/CD and its actions. I've not used it in an enterprise sort of way. It's only been small projects, so can't really say there's too much I hate.
Great. Cool. Then we have, at least on my list, 3 left. And you gotta pick the next one. So we have DevOps, we have Azure Devops, Bitbucket pipelines, and then we have Code Catalyst. So which one do you want to? And Circle CI, 4 actually.
Yeah. So Circle CI so we started using it with GitHub originally, and actually using it at the moment now with Bitbucket. So, going back again, it's not linked into source control, so the fact it's separate is a bit annoying. But obviously because they are quite a big company and all they're offering is effectively this CI/CD tool, and it is, as you would expect, it's got a lot of power. There's a lot of options, lots of integrations. You've kind of got a decent single sign-on integration with Atlassian and so on, whatever you're using. But I think the actual cost of it is quite interesting. They use like a token system, and you burn through tokens based on how many minutes of build time. So it's all based on how many build minutes. So the quicker your build is, the cheaper it is. So I guess in a way that's good. But yeah, I have no issues with Circle CI. The main reason we use it at the moment is because it offers Mac runners. So we need to build an iOS app, and Circle CI has got that option. It's just a reason we're using it. Simple as that.
But I think there is no other CI/CD tool that offers that out of the box that we kind of have on our list today. There is CodeMagic, I think, that you could use for the same thing, but they are really focused on mobile app development, and that is a little bit limited sometimes.
Yeah.
Cool. So you don't like that it's not connected to a source code repository, that you need to bring that on your own, right?
Yeah.
Other than that, it has most of the CI functionalities or CD functionalities that you need, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah. You push into GitHub or wherever your source control is, and you get an email saying it's failed. Like, you don't get any immediate feedback unless you navigate to it. But if you do navigate to it, you've got a lot of power, got a really good tooling UI. If you set environment variables in there, you can never re-look at them. Like, it kind of one-way hashes them, which is a bit annoying, but it's just little things like that come across.
Cool. Then, now, I'm going to pick the next one. We're going to do Bitbucket. And there's 300 different flavors of Bitbucket. So which one do you have experience with?
So with Bitbucket, it's interesting. I've originally used Bitbucket as a personal repo before kind of GitHub kind of took off. But at the moment, it's, a lot of these, the reason there are so many different tools is because that's what the client is using when we started working with them. In this case, Bitbucket is being used because, the company's using Jira and they needed source control, and it's kind of all linked together. So if you're using Jira, then the integration is obviously the best. You can obviously have integrations elsewhere, but you can, as you merge into main, move that ticket onto the next column and things like that automated, and you can go into a Jira ticket and you can see all the code associated with it and so on a lot easier. So that's really nice. I think general Bitbucket's just relatively basic. That's really nice. I think, and see how many commits or kind of what things developers are doing. So I'd have to know which repos they might have worked on. I'd have to go looking for branches, looking for commits, just to see what they recently worked on. And so if they've gone on holiday and I want to know what they were doing last week, because we've got, trying to pick up what they did can be quite hard to find. So I don't think it's particularly strong for large sort of repos and for maybe enterprise, but it's good for sort of smaller companies, maybe small, medium businesses.
And I assume that you're talking about bitbucket.org, right? So kind of the cloud version of Bitbucket, and then combined with Bitbucket pipelines as well.
Yeah. Sorry, yeah, exactly. And I think it's got integrated runners and so on. So if you want to just get something simple, go and pay for that. It's fine.
Yeah, and we are using we have been using Bitbucket for source control, and I personally think that it's powerful, very, very powerful, right? But I've never used the Bitbucket pipelines integration, so I cannot really speak to that. On the other side, for enterprises, using the data center version of Bitbucket really made a difference for us, right? At least.
Yeah, I've not got any experience.
And the user interface, I like it more than the GitHub one, right? And I actually also like it more than the Code Catalyst one, because it is cleaner, it is well thought, right? And the possibilities to have plugins integrated and advanced permissions, pull request views, all of that kind of stuff, right? I think that's where Bitbucket as a source control system really stands out, compared to others where it doesn't really feel natively.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it feels polished, I would say. I do think it feels polished.
Yeah, and Bitbucket pipelines I didn't really use, so can't really speak to that. But I think,
yeah, I've never had an issue. The pipelines have actually been pretty good. It's again, you get so many minutes a month, and it just triggers, works fast. Got decent integration with their pull requests and so on.
Cool. Then let's tackle Azure DevOps.
Yeah, so I think Azure DevOps, it's very comprehensive. You have a lot of tools. I think it makes sense to use if you are using the project management side, rather than say Jira. Then it's all integrated together. So I think if you're in that ecosystem, or if you're using Azure especially, then it does make sense. It's actually quite a lot of features in there. I spent quite a bit of time building pipelines in it for one of the clients when we were doing a deployment into AWS, and you'd have a lot of capability in them. You could have kind of like different configs, and they would be sort of like a hierarchy of configs, so you can kind of start refactoring your source control configs. So yeah, it's quite good. I think people still think of TFS when they think of DevOps, which means that they avoid it. And I think if you are not using Azure and you're not using the other like task management, project management side, and you're just using it for source control and CI/CD, I probably wouldn't go straight to it. Just it feels a bit odd to me at that point. But
so it makes sense from an integration perspective, where you kind of cover the full life cycle, as far as I understand you. Okay.
And it's quite enterprise. It's very enterprise. So I think if you've got, if you are an enterprise, it links into your like Outlook and kind of SSO and all that sort of stuff. It does kind of make sense then.
Cool. And then, last but not least, I can talk hours about Code Catalyst, but I'd be interested too. Did you have a look yet or not yet?
Yeah, so I've not done a lot with it. I basically did a couple of personal projects, like playing with it a little bit, and this was a while ago. And I thought, like, it's a decent idea, but it was quite early days, and I've not seen a need to go any further. I've always thought that if I was going to do from scratch, like an AWS deployment, I'd definitely look at that rather than going straight to code pipeline first. But then also, I can just do a CDK pipeline. check it into. I don't know. I probably wouldn't go for code commit. I think code commit's pretty bad, but let's just push it into say GitHub or something like that. And I've got myself a code pipeline and it's working all right. So I've not really seen much need for Code Catalyst in that sense.
Yeah, makes sense. And Code Catalyst is still early stages, as you said. It's like 18-month old now. There's a lot of things that need to be polished, but it offers everything that you need right now to do production-grade deployments, and I use that for some of my production deployments as well. I don't. Well, what do I like? The promise of being integrated into the AWS ecosystem, which is not always fulfilled in the way that I would expect it to be, but a lot of the things are already there, and I hope that more are coming. I also like the visualization of the workflow engine for CI/CD pipelines, because that's something that others don't really directly have, right? They have that post-execution, but not pre-execution, which is kind of one of the USPs here. And then something, well, I don't know if I like or hate it, workflow definitions in YAML.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the same thing in GitHub. And most of the other providers as well, right? So
yeah, it's pretty much you have to be good at YAML if you want to do CI/CD.
Yeah, that's why. I don't know if you've seen the project Progen Pipelines that I'm working on with Torsten, where we are trying to define an abstract version of a CI/CD pipeline, which would then actually render that YAML stuff for you, so you don't need to know the details for all of the tools that we just mentioned, right? So that's what the project is meant to be. So I think that can help a lot there, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think I've spent a lot of time doing CI/CD over the years in many different places, and it's lots of putting bash scripts here and there, figuring out how you do all the different YAML for, I want to trigger on this, I don't want to trigger here, I want to trigger on a delete, but I can't, I want to trigger on a pull request or a merge request. It's just a lot of translation, a lot of figuring out how each individual CI/CD system works and the quirks and so on. Even things like when you have multiple tasks, like I want to run linting and then I want to run tests, I want to run this. Well, ideally, I'd want to run them in parallel. But on some CI/CD systems, you can't do that without having to have separate containers and then doing npm install 5 times. And on others, you can. So
then let's get to the most important part of this talk. If you were a person working in a startup, what would you pick?
That's a tricky one. I think I probably, if I was a startup, I'd probably GitHub, I guess, because everyone's already set up with GitHub, and I've got I'd probably actually go for Bitbucket or Git. If I was a startup, because there's no reason to go for like the cost and things and the extra features of something like GitLab. I want something that's integrated in and quite simple. I don't have to go and try and do these cross integrations like setting up Circle CI. So I think if you just start with GitHub, you can pretty much just log into your personal account, create a new repo, and you're done. Maybe pay for enterprise, and you've got something that's up and running and deploying within an hour. Maybe you'd go for Bitbucket if you're using Jira. You're deciding actually, let's just pay for Bitbucket at the same time and just go for the cloud versions of both.
Okay. And if you were an enterprise, what would you pick?
I think it probably, well, it kind of depends on what, let's say if they're using Jira, then rather than Azure Devops project management, and you'd probably, I think GitLab I definitely would look into GitLab, because I think the extra features, the security stuff in there, I think it's actually, there's a lot to be said about it, especially for enterprise, because you have a lot more control there. I think if you're using Jira, then you would consider probably maybe Bitbucket, because you've got the kind of permissions and all that kind of control in there. don't think I'd use GitHub for enterprise. I mean, the AI stuff that's in there is handy, but also scary for enterprises. So probably want to avoid that kind of personal branding of GitHub. If you're an enterprise, you'd probably be going for DevOps, Bitbucket or Gitlab.
Cool. Thanks. That's all I had for today. I think it was a pretty good conversation with a lot of details. And I hope that everyone that listened learned something about the different tools that are out there today. And Martyn, any other comments, questions from me? We never got into kind of introduction and what the hell are you doing these days. So maybe we can do that as a wrap up.
Not much to say extra. Like I've been, it's just been an interesting journey with AWS. Like it's been a few years now I've been on there, and obviously that first year when we met at reInvent, and I think the community is something special. So I'm hoping to be doing more and more kind of content going forward and getting more involved in the community. I'm just going to keep on building.
So where can people find you these days online? Are you more the LinkedIn, more the Twitter user? Oh, sorry, the X user.
Yeah, I probably, I use LinkedIn more for content, and my blog is probably the best place to find most of my stuff. I share the blog across, dev.to and stuff like that, but it's always linking back to my website.
Cool. Thank you so much. Any famous last words, Martyn, before we end for today?
Just good luck in the next game day.
Let's see. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much, Martyn. Bye-bye.
Thank you.